You know, there is a spottable difference between an amateur and a professional writer that goes way beyond talent and shows the craft of it all. And sometimes there are poor habits that sneak in when you're starting out. So, what are these common quote unquote red flags that make a narrative feel unpolished, even if the idea behind it is amazing, awesome, and unique? The truth is that beginners tend to lean on these red flags without realizing it's happening. They don't necessarily know better. But the good news is that you're allowed to break the rules and take back control over these red flags because once you recognize the patterns, you can start changing how you approach your prose, characters, and world building. Let's get into it because today is about the red flags that scream amateur writer and how to fix them. So today we're just going to call them out. We're going to talk about them, and then maybe the solutions. We don't know. We don't know. But before we get started, please hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss out, especially if you've been enjoying these videos. So hit red flag number one: far too much, with far too little impact. New writers often separate everything, starting a page off with a description, leading to some action that gets characters in place, getting to the dialogue with a few action beats, and then finally closing out the scene. This usually feels more like a checklist of things that need to be accomplished in the chapter. However, it can mess with pacing for sure, making things drag instead of a nice smooth movement of cause and effect. Pros need to weave it all together. They connect narrative beats. They allow description to move through the rhythm, and dialogue and exposition, etc., etc. It all fits into one solid movement. It isn't necessarily paint by colors. Because one line can have some plot moving. Maybe another line can paint the scene. Maybe another line can reveal character, and so forth and so on. Because remember, every line, no matter if it's dialogue, description, etc., must contain one or more of these three elements: plot, character, or world building. It must move the plot forward, develop the characters, or build on your world. It could be one of those, two of those, or three of those for every single sentence. And ultimately, you can always read your page out loud to figure out if you're doing it or not. If it feels like basically, hey, I think this is only description for description's sake and not necessarily world, plot, or character, how do we play with it? Well, I have an example for you. Boop. Oh, wait. Boop. All right. So over here, this is an example of what it might feel like for a traditional newbie, as somebody who's starting out, a baby writer or author, and they're just playing. They're going, "Hey, let me at least establish the introduction. Let me get into the dialogue, and then let me get out of there." And it basically reads like this. The cityscape broke over the harsh steel walls of Eden, the capital city lost in the dark clouds of smog and waste. David coughed, covering his mouth with a makeshift mask. You need to buy a real one, Al said, his voice muffled in his fancy face mask and helm. It's breathe or eat, and I've already spent weeks starving. A loud beep popped as David entered the factory, holding the door open for his friend. The place had filters, enough for him to lower his rag. Now, the issue with this is, yeah, stuff is happening, but nothing is really particularly happening. And when you write where it feels everything's separate, where this is the dialogue part, this is the introduction, this is the description that explains where they are, and this is just going forward, it loses a little something. So this is taking the same example, and then, yeah, there's going to be more written into it, but the point is, it's going to be moving through more than just description, dialogue, out. It's going to add character to things and plot, etc., etc., and it's going to move through character. The cityscape broke over the harsh steel walls of Eden, the capital city lost in the dark clouds of smog and waste. David hunched in a rush forward, waving his arm ahead of him, trying to break up the thick air. He coughed, covering his mouth with a makeshift mask. Fuck! He pulled the dirty rag away, coated in a chunk of tar broken from his throat. You need to buy a real one, Al said, his voice muffled in his fancy face mask and helm. David shook his head, flicking the black tar from his dirty rag, a Rorschach staining its browns and holes. It's breathe or eat, and I've already spent weeks starving. I'm not doing that again. A loud beep popped as David entered the factory. Go first, he said, holding the door for his friend. You're so kind. You know that? Al's smile had a touch of judgment in it, one David had gotten used to over the years. Nowadays, friends were an opportunity for survival. The place had filters, enough for him to lower his rag, and he did at his own risk, but that did not mean he would be safe from the Corins. The Corins. All right, a couple things are happening here. First, this is definitely in the POV of David. All right, we kept the same original sentence basically, and then we added a beat of David. David. All right, so now David is experiencing this opening beat. David is involved in it. He's ultimately uh, uh, he's reacting to the environment. So that's the important element. So the original, if we go back to the original, right? It just explains. It's a description and explains that this is the lost city in the dark, right? This is actually allowing David to interact with the environment, which makes it more lived in and tangible. It is influencing the narrative forward. So we have character, we have plot, and we have world building. Okay, so there's stuff going on within that beat. Now he is continuing to move within that environment, so he is reacting to it by covering his mouth. Okay, and then he curses, which is dialogue. So we are mixing dialogue in, and then he pulled away his rag. Da 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 da. All right. Beep. Let's go back here. All right. So he pulled away the dirty rag, coated in a trick. So now it is influencing him. The environment is still very present in the scene. So even though we use description and character in the beginning, it doesn't mean the environment banishes it. It should still influence what's going on in the scene. Then we bring in his friend, and they have the nice little conversation. But I continue to do that. So even when he opens the door, a loud beep, okay, popped as David entered the factory. He said, holding the door for his friend. So the door is still part of the narrative. The factory is a part of the narrative. And this is the issue that I would say less experienced writers run into, is they forget that all of it needs to play together. The dialogue needs to move through character, through plot, through the world. The description needs to be through the POV of a character or omniscient, which is still a character. All right. You need to mix and match these things so there's a smooth transition from each from each passage, from each narrative beat. And that's really how you start adjusting it. You basically you just read over your stuff. If it just feels like it's describing something and there's no character within that description, add some character. If it's just dialogue and there's no movement with the dialogue, add a little bit of movement. Not that you have to do it for everything. Like, like for example, you're so kind, you know that? I don't need a tag there. I don't need an action beat. I don't need description. Sometimes you could just give the dialogue. But it's about mixing it up, a little here, a little there, right? But more importantly, allow the environment to be part of the movement. All right. With that, let's get to red flag number dos. Overusing numbers in descriptions. Beginners. People who just don't know better. By the way, beginners isn't a negative word. We all start somewhere. But it isn't uncommon for beginners to be like, he was 6 foot tall. He walked 300 yards, a 50-pound sack. It turns vivid scenes into basically a blocking element. Like it feels like data instead of actual movement. This kind of writing can remove a lot of the life from the page, though it isn't impossible to utilize numbers. The red flag isn't that you are using numbers. The red flag is overusing numbers. Overusing numbers. So you can use numbers, but if everything is like to the T, to the detail, because you can do it, but everything should have a purpose. Otherwise, readers don't need a tape measure to figure out how long the hallway is. What they do need, though, is to feel the weight, feel the distance, feel the presence. So, for example, you could basically use sensory, right? If somebody is tall, they loomed over her. If the field is really long, instead of saying it's 20 yards long or 300 yards long, you say the field stretched far enough to swallow the sound, or his friend vanished in the distance. Whatever the case is, okay. The horizon broke at the edge of the field's drop. Okay. Maybe the bag dragged like it carried stones. So it's heavy. The bag is heavy, but the bag dragged like it carried stones. Ultimately, what's happening is you're using this as an opportunity to add some texture and um, value to it. You want to move through experience. Remember, narratives are made up of both plot and story. Plot is what needs to happen no matter what. And story is how plot moves through the emotional experiences and choices of your characters. So whenever the bag dragged like it carried stones, that is experience of the characters. If it is the person was tall, that is plot. But you need plot to work through story, which is he loomed over her. Or if it's first person, he loomed over me. If it's omniscient, uh, his presence loomed over her. Okay? Whatever the case is, the experience, the emotional experience and choices of the characters. Also, remember, if it's third person or first person and they're using loomed, that is not only just their emotional experiences, but they're making the choice to recognize that height. They are choosing to recognize the height difference. Okay? Don't get me wrong, though. Numbers do have their place when it truly, absolutely matters and adds something to the narrative. But most of the times, I would lean on impression over measurement. Lean on that experience and choices, the emotional experience. All right. Basically, if the number doesn't really spark an emotional experience, it's not really worth it. All right, number three. Telling too big of a narrative. Look, I'm all for massive fantasies. I love a big saga. I love a good series. 2 books, 3 books, 10 books. I don't care. Give me the big ones. But too big of a narrative for the beginners could be overwhelming, or the skill set to connect such depth may not necessarily be there just yet. And I know more than anyone how tempting a massive narrative can be. And at times, it might be the thing you need to write. I get it. It's tempting to dive right into it as first, even if your 15th book, you're like, hey, I want 15 books out of this. I want 20 books out of this. You know what? This first book is so good. I can't wait to write 1,700 books. Sure. Millions will die if the war continues. We get that, right? If the novel is big enough and the story is big enough, the saga is big enough, we know that there's so many stories within a war. But huge journeys might not always be the narrative you need to be telling, at least now. It might be what you want to tell, but it is not right for the narrative you're trying to write. What am I saying? I'm saying we as people connect through small personal journeys. So if you have to write a big story that isn't necessarily a series or a saga, but you're like, I want this one book to feel massive. Remember, it's not necessarily that a war is happening, that we know people are dying. It's really more about the personal journeys of the characters within it. And a lot of times, people who are starting out and they're writing something vast, something big, they forget about the characters. The characters simply become a tool to move the plot forward, and not necessarily that they are experiencing things. Remember, emotional experiences and choices. So the difference really comes down to framing. If it's a big epic fantasy, or it's a sci-fi, or whatever the case is, you might have 10 characters, right? That makes it big. But remember, one family's empty table or a child's lost toy amid ruins can create a greater depth in the larger picture. It adds texture, it adds movement. Let me explain. So, even if epic narratives need to have a place for your fights, I get it, or your dragons, or your massive land, your massive sceneries, there still needs to be place for heart, still needs a place for emotional payoff, right? Because it is more interesting to read about a soldier's trembling hand, okay, which can be extremely personal, all right, than it is to write about there was an army that spread the field beyond our eyes, okay? Experiencing that through a soldier is more interesting. And not that you can't have the soldiers span the field beyond our eyes, but now move in closer, go into that tighter shot, right? Like I always talk about film framing. All right, get the close up. But also, a queen's quiet doubt is more interesting than a queen rules. The queen rules over the land. But we want to know more about her. It's in these small personal moments within the larger narrative that actually help zoom in. It helps the reader zoom in on the grandness because we are seeing what's at stake. We are seeing the human side. So that is one of the elements that a lot of newer writers fail with. They tell too big of a narrative without going deeper into the zoom, the emotional beats. All right, okay, I'm just saying. Remember, let larger tragedy seep through the eyes, their losses, and the emotional experiences to influence their choices. This ground scale turning distant stakes into something that adds to the arc. Because readers root for people they understand, not the war of kings. Number 4, yeah. Prioritize sympathy over rooting interest. What does this mean? Let's get into it. If I may, you need to earn your endings, your character journeys. But what does that even mean? Well, this is an at the start of a narrative problem or a we're meeting a character for the first time issue. So let me explain that. We're at the start of a narrative or we're just meeting a character for the first time. See, dumping hardship on a character right away doesn't necessarily lead with empathy. Right? Audiences don't care about your characters yet. Sure, you can start with a fun car chase or running through a city, maybe even an assassin walking through a building and they have 17 knives, knowing how to use every one of them, right? But remember, there are no real stakes yet. Why? Because the readers have no idea who this character is to care about them. So, yes, you can start on big, but know that it's starting blind for the readers as long as you understand that. And that's okay. If it's leading somewhere emotional, or that we're going to get some depth, or it's saying something of note where it's adding to the plot, building character, or it's in the process of building your world. But honestly, she wept over her dead parents means nothing if a reader barely knows who she is or who her parents were. Pity without investment can lead to cheap experiences. This is why you have to first give us a reason to care. This might happen as you show her stubborn spark, her quirky habit, or her quiet courage in an ordinary moment. I once had somebody say to me that like some of their critiques on books and stuff like that, they're always like, you know, uh, my advice to this person was that we need to know more about this character because we don't know what's going on. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, the character is like talking to another character. I don't know who they are. Uh, so do you think the first 2 pages should just be like explaining who these characters are? My chair fell. And they said, yeah. And I go, but there's no movement there. Nothing is happening. It's okay to slowly discover who a character is. That is not the issue. The issue is when you're allowing them to move through an intro or you're introducing a character that is doing something where you feel there's a payoff because you are emotionally invested in the characters. There's nothing wrong with having a new character start off a chapter 7 and moving through the motions and things are happening. There's plot, there's character development, and there's world building, but also it has immersion, etc., etc., and we're experiencing it through their emotional choices and experiences, right? So the big difference is if the opening beat or the new character is doing something where in your mind wow, this is an emotional hit. Remember, you have the relationship with these characters. The reader doesn't. So the way you get around that is slowly build them. Here's an example. If you haven't read Death of the King yet, this isn't really giving away anything, but the prologue, I have something crazy that happens in the prologue. So before I could get to that, I need the first beat of a character to be where we develop a relationship with them. If I jumped, I had someone tell me once, some reader, they were like, "Why don't you just start with this thing?" And the thing they said to start with was all the chaos, all the crazy, and not you can't. We're not going to be able to experience the emotions of the characters. Who are these characters? Why are they running around? Like, what do I care? I don't know who these people are. But because of that opening scene, the majority of alpha readers and the majority of my beta readers all love how emotionally connected specific characters, I'm not going to give it away, and what they have to go through that chaos together. So that's what I'm saying. Doesn't mean you can't start off in the middle of doing something, because they are technically in the middle of doing something in that first scene, but you have to build your characters in a short amount of time before you start putting them into chaotic situations. Basically make people curious about who they are. You know what I'm saying? So when trouble does hit, the pain actually lands, the chaos actually lands, the payoff actually lands, because you have to build the hook through action voice positions. Positions are their beliefs, all before the suffering begins. And it will begin. You have to have connection before suffering. Earn your endings, earn your moments, and earn the relationships between your characters and the readers. The goal is ultimately to get readers to care about your characters and stay with these characters for 81,000 words or more. So give them something to care about. The fifth red flag is failing to answer basic reader questions. I am the first to stand by vague but informative. This is the simple rule of giving enough information or context for the reader to know what's going on, but leaving enough unanswered information for them to want to know more. This is because mystery draws readers in, but honestly, without context or information, confusion will push them out of the narrative. And yes, new writers sometimes assume we know the rules of their world and their characters because they are so familiar with them. They're not thinking about, I need to educate the reader. And I get it. I do. You've been sitting with these characters forever, this world forever. Everything is literally second nature to you. And of course, you know the value of coins in your world, how all the traveling works, why people act a certain way, their cultures, etc. It's your world. You designed it. Whether it's a romance, whether it's fantasy, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's a thriller, whether it takes place in New York. It's clear in your head, but it's not in your reader's head. They just found this place you call Baradimium. Ugh, right? They don't know what that means, because a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? And this is the thing. Let me tell you something. Whether you like Star Wars or not, whether you like George Lucas or not, what makes A New Hope so strong? And I will be the first to say, I don't enjoy Star Wars New Hope much as I enjoy other elements of Star Wars, especially the mythology. I love the mythology. But like Empire obviously is a stronger film. But that first film, what George is doing that most people don't do, especially up to that time, is allow the world to move through the characters. They don't explain what the baths are, they don't explain what droids are, they don't explain what they're farming. They don't explain, right? Because the context is there. They are farming a resource. It is not narratively important to understand what they are farming and why and how they do it. Okay? But it is important to know that they are farming, and that's why they need the droids and that blah blah blah, right? I'm just saying. Context is important. So the easy fix to all of this is seeding, or slip basic plot, character, and world building points into the narrative naturally, and way early on. A character haggling over bread prices, grumbling over the long road, or upset over the city's law is more informative through showing than it is having a narrative exposition dump. However, if a beta reader asks, "What's a slave, an assassin, or a peasant's work schedule?" I would ignore that because it's not important. What I'm talking about is, again, if it is narratively important, make sure it's known. If it is contextually important, make sure it's known. Somebody's work schedule is not important unless it's important. If it is really about a peasant's work schedule because they go to work, yes. But if there is a peasant and they are in the story, but they are not necessarily the protagonist or whatever, it's not important. So you have to figure out what contextually sets up enough information so readers understand what is going on, but not enough where they have all the answers. You want them to at least learn over the course. You do want to give those answers up, but over the course of the narrative. And the reason is because the confusion should lie within the world you establish. If a character is an assassin, how does that world work? Not through exposition, but through their behavior. Are they hired? If so, how? Is it through a guild, a contract, etc.? John Wick, that first movie is amazing because we learn about the lived in world. And each movie does expand on that world building, which I love. But when he hands in those coins, when we first see the coins, we don't understand the coins because they give us enough context that, oh, if he gives a coin for this, he gets a service. He pays for this. He pay. All right, I understand the context of that. But you don't have to go overboard and explain it. My point is, you don't have to answer every question, but you do need to answer enough questions for the reader to understand what, where, when, why, and how it all works, at least a little, to follow along. With that said, before I go, just know that I have some books available, and also makearightleft.here.com. I'm not going to go into the whole spiel because you can see it on all my videos, but I do have 3 books. Makearightleft.here.com. We have my epic fantasies book, which is exclusively on Patreon. We have my self-help book, which is the book 1 of 5, The Foundation for Longevity, and of course, we have the 27 plot point outline. You can find that all on makearightleft.here.com. Let's get into it. The right mindset, perspective, and then we get to say goodbye. To be clear, red flags aren't judgments on your worth as a writer. I'm here to simply point out the signposts of common mistakes and habit forming ones to show you where most newer authors linger. The more you understand about craft and being a writer, the more you can spot what is working and what is not working. And the bias that hold a writer back can destroy their narrative if they're not able to spot it sooner rather than later. As you develop your skills and the tools to notice these things, you're creating a strong foundation for growth as a writer. Besides, every pro author once wrote pages full of these habits, revised, learned, and grew from it all. We do not start off great, and even great is not a master because they should always be learning. Besides, you're already doing the brave part, putting words down and caring enough to refine them, to think about them, to wonder, to ask questions. So keep trusting the process, keep showing up, keep doing the work, and your voice will find its way. And it's worth every single step because you get the right. Now, this is not a video in a series. This was a special request video, so thank you very much for the request out there. I just figured, hey, I'm glad I was asked to do a video like this. What are some habits that cause issues for amateur writers, or at least, as they put it, writers starting out, that they should look for? But if you have other videos you'd like me to do, let me know in the comments, and I'll record a random video and pop it up. And as you all know, I have the year planned out, so these are really random videos. So if you put a comment down, say I want a video on XYZ, I'll make it and randomly post it. Okay, so if you want a video on a specific thing, or you want me to expand on an older video, just let me know. Like what you saw today? Well, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss out. If you found this stuff helpful, please give it a thumbs up. YouTube loves the fueling of the algorithm. Oh, and remember, every Saturday and Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I do real-time examples on Saturdays, and then every Sunday I do the Write a Book with Me from concept to completion. I'm Thomas J. Bellezza. As always, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Bye.